Well, welcome to our 9th class on Christian basics, or for my Lutheran teenagers out there, confirmation. Every week we aim to bring you biblical content that helps you in your new or emerging walk with Jesus Christ. We've looked at all of Genesis, which is a lot in a short amount of time. Now we're going to start moving a little bit faster into the Old Testament. We're going to look today at the Exodus, the story of God's people getting out of Egypt under the leadership of Moses and eventually into the wilderness and later on into the Promised Land. I'm Evan McClanahan, by the way. I'm the pastor down at First Lutheran in Houston, and look forward to this guest presentation today with Ted Wright of Epic Archaeology again, as we look at the Exodus. Well, just to set the scene a little bit, at the end of Genesis, we see that Joseph ends up in Egypt because his brothers tried to kill him. His brothers end up in Egypt as well, and their families go on to live there for many hundreds of years. And after about 430 years or so, there were a lot of Israelites in Egypt, and that came to be a problem. And so the Egyptians actually were going to kill all of the male Hebrew children born. And Moses was spared from that. He was put in a little basket and put in the Nile River, and he was saved. He was picked up, and Ted has an interesting theory as to who that might have been that picked him out of the Nile. But he was picked up, and he ended up in the Pharaoh's household, and he grew up in Egypt as an Israelite, but among the Egyptians. Now, he eventually had to flee, and 40 years later, he is called back into Egypt to let the people of God go. So Ted's going to tell us that story and talk a lot about just some of the good evidence for the Exodus itself as being a historical event. So without any further ado, let's bring Ted in. Well, Ted, thanks for joining me again. We had a great time talking about Genesis 4 to 11 a couple of videos ago, and now we're looking at the Exodus. And basically where we're at is we know that there was a guy named Moses, that he grew up. He was spared from the killing of the firstborn of the Israelites in Egypt, or not. I shouldn't say the firstborn. It was all the male children that they wanted to kill because there were too many. Anyway, he was spared from that. Ended up being raised in Pharaoh's household, and after he witnessed an Israelite be killed, he had to flee. So he essentially went into the wilderness for 40 years, but God comes to him in this burning bush that doesn't ever burn and says, I need you to go back into Egypt. I need you to get your people, the Israelites, the sons of Jacob. I need you to get them out. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of people, maybe 1 million or something to that effect. And so there are a number of things in that story then that you would say can be archaeologically proven or demonstrated or something like that. So Ted Wright from Epic Archaeology, by the way, epicarchaeology.org, go there. Tell us a little bit about kind of the big picture, and let's talk about just a few of the big pieces of evidence really for the Exodus, so that, if someone's out there wanting to kind of believe in God, right, or understand the story of the Bible,
Right.
They don't have to park their brain at the door, right, to believe
That's
this. Like you can actually believe this stuff happened.
That's right. That's exactly right. I'll start out with a story from Indiana Jones, obviously.
Yes. All right.
So in the first movie, in Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I'm hoping that everybody saw that. If you haven't, then shame on you. You need to go watch it.
It's a classic.
Raiders of the Lost Ark. Evan, I'll test your knowledge on this, see how many times you've watched it. So
Okay.
Indy and his sidekick, Salah, they're there in Tanis in Egypt. And the Nazis are digging, and then of course they snuck in. They're incognito, and they are looking for the Well of the Souls. Remember that?
I remember that.
They find this hole, and then so Indy just drops down into the hole, and he gets the staff of Ra, and the light comes in. And what do they discover when Indy puts the staff in the slot? What do they discover?
Oh my gosh, Ted. I mean, I remember that the sun comes through a gem at just the right place and it shines on something, but I don't remember what they discovered. You got me on that one.
The Nazis are digging in the wrong place.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Right. That I knew, that because the Nazis are all kind of in the background and they're kind of quietly trying to hide and not be seen. Yeah. It's really a beautiful shot too. The sun is setting.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Great shot. It's very iconic. So that is perfect illustration of the Exodus, and a lot of liberal skeptical scholars they're looking for the Exodus in the wrong place, and what I mean is in the wrong time. So several years ago, an archaeologist who's now retired, his name is Dr. William Deaver from the University of Arizona. I was actually mentored by one of his doctoral students, and also had classes and got my bachelor's degree in archaeology under one of his colleagues, Dr. Joe Sager. Anyway, Dr. Deaver wrote a book some years ago called "What Did the Biblical Writers Know and When Did They Know It?" Which is a great question, and it's a great title of a book, because that's the key issue. What did the biblical writers know? Did Moses actually write the Exodus? Was he there? Was he an eyewitness to the Exodus, events of the Exodus? And when did they know it? Was this written after the fact? Was it made up? But the Bible gives us internal evidences of when to look for the Exodus in the historical record. And one, I'll give you two. One is in 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1, which basically says, this is narrative, by the way, it's not poetry. And the biblical writer in 1 Kings 6:1 basically says, in the 480th year after the Exodus, Solomon lays the foundations of a temple in Jerusalem. So he's connecting. This is a chronological marker, and if we take that number literally, 480 years, you can do the math, and we know approximately when that happened. In fact, most scholars, this is not a controversial date. The date of the laying of the foundations of that temple was around 966 to 967 BC. So when you do the math, 479 or plus or minus years, that's about 1446 BC. So this is during a period called the Late Bronze Age, and in Egypt, it's in a time period of about the middle of the 18th dynasty of Egypt. So the way it turns out, Evan, is that there are among evangelicals, and I think most evangelicals follow the early date, but there's basically two dates for the Exodus that people look at of when it happened. And one of them is called the early date, and that's about 1446. That's the date that I hold to. And the other date is called the late date, and that's about 1236, 1237 BC, which would place the Exodus sometime during the reign of Ramses II. There's a lot of problems with that, and we could spend hours just on that alone. But let me just say that having studied this for goodness, I'm not exaggerating. I've literally been studying this for over 20 years, and I've followed every avenue. I've looked at all the scholarship, and I finally landed, I believe, the best evidence lands in the early date, and which then places the Exodus during the reign. Sometime it straddles between Tutmosis III and a pharaoh by the name of Amenhotep II. And the archaeological record is just really comes alive, and we can see this in the archaeological record. Keep in mind, the Egyptians are not going to record this catastrophe that happened in Egypt, because you have to know the Egyptian mindset. In ancient Egypt, the most important thing was the pharaoh's job was to keep ma'at, and that word ma'at is a Egyptian word. It literally means cosmic order. There were always forces trying to bring Egypt into chaos. There were forces in the Nile flooding. Periodically there would be plagues and things like that. So the pharaoh, his job was to keep order, and he could not keep order in this plagues, and then finally with the Exodus itself. And then all the plagues, all the 10 plagues actually correspond to one or more Egyptian deities. So this was a cosmic conflict between the gods of Egypt and the Hebrew God Yahweh.
Let's just stop there real fast. So what's happening now? Moses, after the burning bush, he's going back into Egypt, and he's armed with the name of God, which we'll unfortunately kind of skip. But basically, he has the name of God, and he's going into Egypt, and he's saying, okay, Pharaoh, probably not Ramses II, but you're saying it could be someone else. You're saying, let my people go. All right, we're busting this joint. We're getting out of Dodge, whatever. We're getting, and that would be bad for Egypt, because that was their labor, because that was like a slave labor force in essence. So the Egyptians don't want that to happen. They don't want there to be any more of them, but they don't want them to leave. And so this is a bad deal. And so Moses says, look, I'm going to give you signs from God that I'm speaking for the one true God. And so there are these 10 plagues, and maybe mention 2 of them and how they're connected to Egyptian gods, and then let's key in on the last one.
So yes, the several of the plagues, the Nile turning to blood, for instance, there will be a Nile god, and his name escapes me off the top of my head, but the cattle definitely the plague of the cattle. The cattle, in fact, the cow god is one of the most sacred gods in ancient Egypt. In fact, it's one of the oldest gods of Egypt, and it dates back to the earliest days of ancient Egypt. What's called the Pre-Dynastic Egypt. So this is really, really early. The cow god was indicative of fertility, and we see this a common theme throughout the ancient Near East. But then the final plague had to do with the Pharaoh himself, who is considered to be the king. He was the embodiment of the god Osiris, and he was to be the one. He was literally God's representative on earth, and so he was supposed to keep order in Egypt, and it was supposed to protect life. But the plague of the firstborn, of course, God told the Israelites to, of course, cover their doorposts with blood, the lamb's blood, and the Pharaoh could not even protect his own son or any of the firstborn in Egypt. So there's a really good book on this by John Currid, who is a professor of archaeology at Reformed Seminary in, I believe it's in Charlotte now. He's in Charlotte. And it's called Against the Gods, and it's the polemical theology of the Old Testament. It's really, really good. He brings out these polemical elements, these cosmic battles between the God of the Hebrews and the God of the Egyptians. And we see this again with the God of the Canaanites. And God always, there's this polemical angle in the Old Testament. The Israelites are not borrowing or trying to steal. They're trying to say to the people that God is the true God, not the Egyptian gods, but the God of the Israelites. And in the case of the Canaanites, remember the episode where Elijah confronts the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And interestingly, Baal is the god of thunder and lightning. He's supposed to be the one to bring thunderstorms and rain, and he can't even do it. He's asleep there. In fact, Elijah taunts him that maybe he's on the potty, and then God, of course, answers the lightning bolt. The same thing is going on with Egypt, and basically they cannot keep law and order in Egypt. Pharaoh cannot keep a reign on all these plagues that are happening, and so this is a divine confrontation between the God of the Hebrews and the God of the Egyptians.
Yeah, interesting. And so the Passover is so important because the crucifixion of Christ, his trial, all of that happens on the Passover Sabbath.
That's right.
Which we believe was actually also on a Sabbath, although whenever the Passover fell, it would be a Sabbath. It would be a day of rest. But anyway, and so the shed blood of the lamb is as a sign of freedom from slavery. It foreshadows the work of Christ, of course, who is
that's right.
His blood is shed for us who are enslaved to sin. So,
right.
But we'll talk about that as we get into the New Testament as well. So, okay, so you got 1 million people or so. They've got to get out of Egypt. They got to get into the Promised Land. And what are maybe, I don't know, top 3 interesting pieces of evidence, if you will, for the story of the Bible being true? We hear about seas parting, right? Moses puts a staff in the ground. They get to the Red Sea. It parts. They walk across. But when the Egyptians follow them, the sea comes in. So are there chariots in the water? That's something people talk about.
Right.
Other bones. I know we've talked about this before in more detail, and you talk about army outposts and things like. Anyway, so what you got?
So the top 3. First, I'm going to start out with where the Israelites were located in Egypt. The city that they were located in Goshen, in the land of Goshen, which is literally it's a more broad term. It's not a specific city. It's the Nile Delta. So it's the marshy area of Egypt. Egypt, of course, is as Herodotus said, Egypt is a gift of the Nile. Egypt would not exist without the Nile. And if you look at a satellite photograph of Egypt from space, what you see is that triangular piece of green land, and then that little green ribbon green-blue ribbon that runs all throughout north, south, and Egypt. And the Nile flows from the south to the north, so it empties out and it fans out in the Nile Delta. So on the eastern branch of the Nile Delta, there is a site, an ancient Egyptian site called Tel El Daba, in the Arabic name for it, but the Egyptian name is Avaris. And for about 30 years or so, there's been an Austrian archaeologist by the name of Manfred B. Tack, and he has discovered, it's not been fully excavated, but they have uncovered a palatial district. They've uncovered a massive area in the site that contained a very large population of non-Egyptians. These are Asiatics. These are people that are not from Egypt. This is known about through the material artifactual remains, shows that these are not Egyptians as well. And interestingly, Evan, another circumstantial piece of evidence that fits in the early date is that all of the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty had their capital in Thebes, way to the south, way down the Nile Delta, or way away from the Nile Delta, very far in the south. Whereas Amenhotep II, who we believe the pharaoh of the Exodus was, had his capital in Memphis, far to the north, and he even had a little palatial compound at Avaris. So he could have actually, Moses and Aaron, if they're based in Avaris in the Nile Delta, could have come in contact with Amenhotep II, which fits exactly what we see. Then also, here's the big thing about Avaris: the site archaeologically goes blank in 1446 BC. And so, in other words, that population of people that are non-Egyptians then just disappears, and they basically the site becomes a burial place, a burial plot. And not only that, but at the same time that these Asiatics were living there, the pharaoh also had a military garrison compound, possibly a chariot force. We do know that weapons were made there, and that also goes blank archaeologically in 1446 BC. There's a really good article by one of my colleagues, Doug Petrovich, called "Toward Pinpointing the Abandonment of Avaris in the during the reign of Amenhotep II." And what he proposes is that there are some Theban tomb paintings and inscriptions that indicate that in the 9th year of the reign of Amenhotep II is when the Exodus occurred, because he does no more military campaigns into Canaan. His father, Tutmosis III, does 17 campaigns. He was considered to be the Napoleon of Egypt. So Amenhotep II, his son, he does 3 or 4 or 5. And then in the 9th year of his reign, everything stops, and he stays in Egypt for the rest of his life. And so this is some really interesting circumstantial evidence that this could be the very pharaoh of the Exodus. And this is the evidence for the Exodus itself. One other interesting tidbit of information about this whole dynastic placement of the Exodus would be the stepmother of Tutmosis III was a queen by the name of Hatshepsut, and she was married to Tutmosis II, and she had of course the pharaoh inheritance was very important, and they wanted to have a male offspring. So so when she married Tutmosis II, they had a daughter first. So then he had a son from a secondary wife, and that son was Tutmosis III. And so anyway, Amenhotep or Tutmosis II died early. So that means that he's a little baby, and now she's like a grown woman. So he has to wait till he's at least 18 or 19 years old, based on Egyptian custom, to reign. So they co-reign for about 20 years together. He's a little boy. But we believe, based on this chronology, that Hatshepsut very likely is the princess, to actually pull Moses from the Nile and basically bring Moses into the household of Tutmosis III. They very likely knew each other. Moses would have been maybe a year or two older than Tutmosis III. And then, of course, Moses then flees to Midian for 40 years. Tutmosis III dies. He comes back to Egypt, and now Amenhotep II is on the throne, and he delivers Israel from Egyptian bondage. So that's what's one just off the off the cuff. I've got one more too that if we have time, I can share as well.
Go for it.
All right. The other one is a little bit, of course, anything you say with deals with archaeology in the Bible is controversial, but to secular scholars, but it's still fairly new. And so time will tell. I personally think that there is great validity to it. I mentioned him earlier as a colleague of mine named Doug Petrovich. So I'll give you the Cliff Notes easy thumbnail sketch version. So what we believe is happening is that when the Israelites entered into Egypt under Joseph and Jacob, of course, remember back 400 years previously, they entered under Joseph, and they were there and they multiplied in the land. Joseph was the vizier of Egypt. He was the second in command of Egypt, and this is a very well-known position in Egyptian society. So he would have had power. He would have been in charge of building projects. He would have been in charge of agriculture. He'd have been in charge of all. I mean, literally, he was running the country of Egypt. Joseph was. So what we think happened was he put his brothers in charge of mining turquoise in the Sinai Peninsula. We know that turquoise was mined because there are turquoise mines. The Egyptians used turquoise extensively in their jewelry, in their a lot of the pharaohs would use it in a lot of their decorations. A lot of their gold would have turquoise in it. So in the Sinai Peninsula, which is that little triangular piece of land just to the southeast of Egypt, Joseph would have likely sent his brothers down to these turquoise mines to work the turquoise mines. Well, there are these inscriptions found at about 3 or 4 of these turquoise mines. They're called the Proto-Synagogic Inscriptions. And these inscriptions are untranslated. They have a language on it that looks like Hebrew, but also Egyptian. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
And years ago, there was a German scholar by the name of Hubert Grimme who proposed that this language was Proto-Hebrew. And Dr. Petrovich has now come out with a book called The World's First Alphabet, and he believes he has cracked the code in deciphering this language as actual Proto-Hebrew. This is basically the very earliest consonantal language. And we did a whole podcast on this for Epic Archaeology. Doug Petrovich is on there. You can go to YouTube, Monocle and Spade. Hebrew is the world's first alphabet. And essentially, what's interesting about this is that he has discovered, if his translations are correct, Evan, he has discovered the name of Moses in these inscriptions, and he's also found the name of Manasseh. So, in fact, the last inscription, I think it's Sinai 351, if my memory serves me correctly. It's one of those inscriptions.
Yeah.
Essentially, it says, this is what it says: "Our bound servitude lingered, and then Moses came and provoked astonishment." And then they're gone. And then these inscriptions, get this now, they disappear in 1446, the same year of the Exodus.
Wow.
And this language then migrates up into Canaan, up into Israel. And scholars today think of it as it is very closely related to Ugaritic, or a different language up in the north. But so anyway, that is if that is the case, if the Proto-Sinaitic language is Hebrew, then all bets are off. I mean, this is the smoking gun of the Exodus. This is the reason why scholars reject that today is because they reject the historical Exodus. But and I think Petrovich is right. I think his inscriptions are correct, and that this indeed is the evidence for the Israelites actually being in Egypt. Also, if that's true, that means Moses could have written the Torah in this language. And we see the language actually, Petrovich actually says that it starts out very, very pictographic. There's pictures in connection with these other little symbols. It actually gets more streamlined as it goes forward in time, which is what language does. You simplify the language as you go forward. And by the time it ends up in Israel, in the Canaan area, it looks like the very ancient Hebrew writing, and then it develops into Hebrew. So this is remarkable. This is quite remarkable. I said this years ago when I first read about this. I believe he's right, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say he's right. And then I'm also going to say this. Back in the 1820s, when the French scholar by the name of Jean-Francois Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone and believed he cracked the reading, nobody believed him either. Nobody believed he did it. And so time will tell if Petrovich is right, and I think it will. I think time will vindicate that he's right. Yeah.
Well, if he's wrong, I don't want to be right, or something like that. But well, we're out of time. This has been super fascinating, folks. This is like drinking from a fire hydrant, as they say, right? A lot of information, and Ted could have gone down into a lot more detail. So I appreciate you, simplifying and keeping it kind of basic for those of us who don't have your memory, probably, among other things. But epicarchaeology.org, that's where to go. Ted Wright is there. Kind of the summary statement for this, Ted, would be that when we read the Bible, let's say you're a 16-year-old kid, you've never read the Bible, you pick it up, you start reading, and it's kind of got some strange stuff in it. What I want to provide is something that says, it might be a little bit out of normal, or out of the norm for our, whatever suburban American experience. But actually, there's no reason to believe that what's recorded in the Bible couldn't have taken place. It's not something that's going to take place every single day or anything like that for us, but that actually is some good evidence, maybe a lot of good evidence.
Yes.
Maybe smoking gun type evidence.
Yes.
That actually this group of people was in this country, and then they left that country, and they left a lot of evidence behind. And so, like you said, you've been studying it for 20 years. We're getting the 20-minute version. But at least I want people to know, hey, even if you're not an archaeologist, even if you're not an expert on this stuff, You know, you don't have to park your brain at the door
That's right.
to believe these stories. And of course, the same is true for resurrection and everything else as well.
That's
but
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, hopefully that was a good summary, Ted.
I hope so. Yes. If people want more, they can go to our website, epicarchaeology.org. Also, check us out on YouTube. There's a lot of videos. There's a couple of lectures on YouTube where we get into some of the detail on the Exodus and also the conquest as well, because the Exodus and conquest stand or fall together. And if there was an Exodus in 1446, then there's going to be a conquest about 40 years after that.
40 years later, right? Because they're punished. They have to stay in the wilderness before they can go into the promised land with which is the story of Joshua. So
that's right.
Excellent, Ted. Well, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Evan. Appreciate it. Glad to be with you.
All right. Well, hang on, Ted. Well, thanks again to Ted for joining me. You know, even though they got out of Egypt, they ended up in the wilderness for 40 years due to their disobedience. And it was during this 40-year time that God and Moses communicate directly, and God actually gives his law to the Israelites, not just the 10 Commandments, but all of the laws about dietary laws and what they could eat and all the sacrifices in the tabernacle. Eventually, those sacrifices would take place in the temple. So this 40-year period is a really important time, and a lot of the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is about this time in the wilderness. Soon, those Israelites, after having spent those 40 years in the wilderness, learning the law, learning to be obedient, they do find their way to the promised land. They carry around the law in the Ark of the Covenant, and God gives them very specific instructions for that. But soon enough, Joshua, not Moses anymore, because Moses is penalized. He's not able to go into the promised land. But Joshua is going to lead the Israelites into the promised land, and that's what we're going to talk about next time. So, thanks so much for joining me this week. Remember, you can email me at christianbasicsclass@gmail.com. Subscribe to this channel. Check out the website, flhouston.org, for websites and more. And until next time, take care.